Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we are taking on a truly fascinating project. We're going to decode the dense, highly symbolic blueprints of the first 11 chapters of the Bible. Known as Primeval History, Genesis 1 through 11 basically lays down the architectural foundation for everything that follows. We're going to unpack these ancient texts to see exactly how they're constructed, revealing a masterfully designed framework of creation, human failure, and divine intervention.
But before we begin, we have to ask a really foundational question. Is Genesis meant to be read as a modern science textbook or, a strict historical timeline? Well, according to the theological framework we're analyzing today, the answer is no. Even historically, within Catholic theology, these texts were never intended to be literal, chronological reporting. Instead, they use pre-modern, highly symbolic language that's meant to be read as profound theological architecture. They're conveying deep conceptual truths about God, humanity, sin, and salvation.
Okay, let's dive into this. We have 6 main steps today: decoding primeval history, the cosmic temple of creation, the anatomy of original sin, recreation through the flood, the architecture of human pride, and finally, funneling down to one man. Let's get started.
Starting right off with Section 1, Decoding Primeval History, the Cycle of Realities. To truly grasp this ancient text, we first have to understand the repetitive blueprint that structures the entire narrative.
From a Catholic theological perspective, Genesis 1 through 11 is built on a continuous rotating cycle. It's like an engine driving these early chapters. First, we have creation, God creating purely out of love. Second, we see rebellion, humanity fracturing that perfect order through their own pride. And third, we see the response, God stepping in, intervening not just with justice, but with merciful grace. This 3-part cycle of grace, rebellion, and response just keeps rotating.
Moving on to Section 2, the cosmic temple of creation, macro and micro scales. We now turn to the creation narrative itself, and as you'll see, the source material does something brilliant here.
In the first creation account, creation isn't depicted as just some random explosion of matter. It's actually structured as a liturgical procession. It's an incredibly orderly, peaceful process of temple building. God speaks the world into existence step by step, taking the universe ex nihilo, out of absolutely nothing, and forming it into a cosmic temple where humanity is meant to worship the Creator. And this grand procession culminates in the capstone, Day 7, the Sabbath. God rests, blessing this day to serve as a permanent, enduring sign of His relational covenant with all of creation.
But then, the text shifts gears completely, from the vastness of galaxies right down to the dirt on the ground. We have this massive macro versus micro pivot between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Genesis 1 is cosmic, right? God speaks majestically from above, ordering the entire cosmos. But in Genesis 2, the scale becomes incredibly intimate. God is no longer just speaking from on high. He is described as physically forming man from the dust of the earth, breathing life directly into his lungs, fashioning woman from his side, and establishing the holy union of marriage in the Garden of Eden. The contrast in pacing and scale here is literally staggering.
So what's the crucial takeaway? Well, despite the radically different scales of these two creation accounts, they lock together perfectly to establish a core theological concept, the imago Dei. It posits that humanity, meaning you, me, all of us, is the absolute pinnacle of creation. According to this framework, humans are uniquely endowed with rational souls, they possess equal and profound dignity as male and female, and they're given a divine vocation to be caretakers of the earth.
Which brings us to Section 3, the anatomy of original sin, the fracture of the blueprint. Unfortunately, this perfect architectural harmony doesn't last. We're now going to examine how human pride begins to fracture the established order.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how a single act of pride shatters everything. In Eden, God provides absolute freedom with just a single boundary. But, driven by pride and a lack of trust, the serpent's deception leads to original sin. And observe how this single act of rebellion shatters harmony in 3 distinct directions. Notice the upward fracture. Humanity is instantly alienated from God, hiding in shame. Then there's the inward or sideways fracture. Harmony between human beings is broken as blame enters their relationship. And finally, the downward fracture. Harmony with nature itself is broken, bringing toil, pain, and physical death into the world.
Yet, right here in the midst of this devastating fracture, the text drops a critical hidden code. It's called the Proto-Evangelium, which literally translates to the first gospel. Found in Genesis 3:15, God declares that the seed of the woman will ultimately crush the head of the serpent. This is a monumental detail. It's the very first announcement of a future Messiah, embedded right at the exact moment of the fall.
Think of this like cracking a master code. The Catholic tradition sees Adam and Eve not merely as figures trapped in the past, but as typographical mirrors reflecting the future. This creates a fascinating typology bridge. Adam, the first man who brings sin, points directly forward to Jesus Christ, the new Adam who brings salvation. And Eve, the mother of the living who listens to the serpent, points to the Virgin Mary, the new Eve, whose obedience unties the knot of the original disobedience. The blueprint of the origin contains the exact structural imprint of the redemption.
And man, this alienation spreads like wildfire. Let's look at the very next generation. The fracture that started in Eden rapidly spirals outward into a contagion. We see the line of Cain. Consumed by jealousy, Cain commits the first murder. His entire line becomes marked by violence, autonomy, and building a culture entirely independent of God. But contrasting this is the line of Seth, Adam's third son. Seth's lineage attempts to preserve the relationship with the Creator, invoking the name of the Lord. The human family is officially fractured.
So that leads into Section 4, recreation through the flood, a cosmic reboot. Because as this contagion of sin rapidly becomes a global issue, the architectural response from the Creator has to scale up globally as well.
The story of Noah in the Great Flood is widely known, but the theological architecture beneath it is absolutely stunning. The floodwaters are not merely a mechanism of destruction, they're actually a deliberate theological uncreation. Human wickedness had multiplied, so the floodwaters return the earth to the formless watery void we saw at the very beginning of Genesis 1. It is a literal cosmic reboot, washing away corruption to allow for a fresh start. And it all culminates in the Noahic covenant, with the rainbow acting as the enduring, visible sign of God's grace.
And this brilliantly illustrates how deeply these ancient texts weave into later theological structures. The historical events of the flood precisely prefigure the structural elements of Catholic sacraments. Noah's Ark, the vessel protecting humanity, prefigures the Church. The floodwaters, washing away global corruption, prefigure the sacrament of baptism, which washes away original and personal sin. And the resulting dry land and new covenant map directly to the new life of a cleansed soul. The architecture of salvation is just remarkably consistent here.
Now we hit Section 5, the architecture of human pride, building upward. We're arriving at the absolute climax of human rebellion in primeval history. Here, the fracture evolves from interpersonal violence into systemic, institutionalized autonomy.
Following the flood, humanity multiplies and settles on the plain of Shinar. But instead of filling the earth like they were instructed, they unite under a banner of profound pride. They decide to build a great city and a tower, likely an ancient Mesopotamian ziggurat, with its top in the heavens. Their explicit goal isn't just architectural curiosity, it's total autonomy. They want to make a name for themselves and bypass God completely by physically building their own pathway to the divine realm. God's judgment on this institutionalized pride is to scatter them by confusing their language, halting construction, and dispersing humanity into different nations.
We can clearly see the contrast between human rebellion and divine intervention when we compare Genesis 11 to the New Testament. The Tower of Babel represents human pride attempting to reach up to God, resulting in the confusion of languages and the ultimate social consequence of sin, humanity completely scattered and divided. But in stark contrast, look at the event of Pentecost in Acts 2. That represents divine grace coming down to humanity. Through the Holy Spirit, many languages are understood as one, bringing ultimate healing and uniting all nations back into one single family. And that brings us to the final stage of our explainer, Section 6, funneling down to one man, the pivot of history. We've been looking at this massive, global, cosmic narrative, but right at the end of Chapter 11, the architecture suddenly changes shape entirely.
To summarize the journey so far, think of it as a giant spiral. We witness the escalation of fracture, starting from interpersonal sin with Cain and Abel, expanding globally to the corruption of the flood, and systematizing at the Tower of Babel. But the absolute key takeaway from this spiral is the expansion of grace. As humanity's rebellion expanded in scope, God's net of merciful intervention expanded perfectly to match it. A protective mark for Cain, an ark and a rainbow for the globe, and for the institutional failure of Babel, a definitive pivot that will alter salvation history forever.
Visually, the conclusion of Genesis 11 acts like a massive funnel. It takes the vast cosmic chaos of all humanity, from the creation of the cosmos to the global flood to the scattering of the nations at Babel, and it funnels all of that massive scope down to a single pinpoint. Genesis 11 ends by zeroing in on just one man living in a specific family, a man named Abram.
And that leaves us standing right on the precipice of the rest of the Bible. The architectural blueprint of primeval history has shown us a fractured world desperate for restoration. So, as this massive global narrative funnels down to Abram, who will soon be called Abraham, we are left with a burning question. How will this one single called family ultimately redeem the entire world? It's a brilliant cliffhanger that transitions the text from primeval history straight into salvation history, an ancient architecture that literally continues to shape the faith of billions of lives today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.